I'd like to call the committee to order. We're meeting today to consider H.R. 5430, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Implementation Act. And Senator Sass isn't here, but he's a new member of the committee, so I'd like to welcome Senator Sass to the committee. And he's joining the committee on one of the most important pieces of legislation we can do this year. And I'm glad to have Senator Sass as a new member of the committee. On December 13th, 2019, the Senate or the House of Representatives received the bill to implement the USMCA agreement. Under fast-track rules, the committee cannot amend the bill. We will vote today only on whether to report the bill. Before we vote, senators who wish to make statements may do so. In the interest of time, I ask that the statements be limited to 3 minutes, and I know that my staff has had a discussion with everybody's staff about that. I hope that that will be satisfactory to the members. We do have a vote scheduled at 12:15, so I think it's important that we get this done this morning. I think we can. After statements, I'm going to introduce staff and administration officials here to provide an overview of the bill and answer any questions, and then we will then vote on the bill. President Trump promised to deliver a strong, updated trade agreement with Canada and Mexico that would reflect the realities of the 21st Amendment. He made this an issue in his campaign, so I suppose this has been an issue that's been around now for more than 3 years. He promised that it would command broad support, and I think President Trump has delivered. The House of Representatives voted overwhelmingly and in a bipartisan way support of the USMCA bill. Now the Senate must act. I'm confident that this bill is going to make it to the President's desk, and I'd like to express a few reasons why I think that way. USMCA will bring much needed certainty and real benefits to America's farmers, workers, and businesses. Farmers are getting better and more reliable market access, which farmers badly need. Workers will see thousands of new jobs, particularly in high-wage manufacturing industries. Businesses will have an agreement that reflects the realities of modern commerce, including for the $1 3/10 trillion U.S. digital economy. USMCA corrects the enforcement flaws that very much plagued NAFTA and ensures that the parties will be held accountable to their commitments. The USMCA has the support of hundreds of organizations representing a wide range of the economy, agriculture groups, business groups, and labor groups. I would like to enter into the record a non-exhaustive list of representatives of this support, and I'll do that without objection. The road that we traveled to arrive at this meeting today tested my patience at times. As an example, taking 3 or 4 months to get the President to remove steel and aluminum tariffs. I don't know how many White House meetings I attended where that was an issue, and I kind of got tired of hearing the words, "I like tariffs." And there are some aspects of this bill that I don't particularly like, but as I reflect on how we got here, I'm proud of the hard work of many individuals that made it possible to achieve a strong agreement and a bill that could garner broad support. And I would put at the top of that list the hard work that Ambassador Lighthizer put into it. The bill before us today has something in it for everyone, and it's not often that we can say that about an implementing bill. I ask my colleagues to vote with me to favorably report the bill, because I'd like to get this to the President's desk. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and a Happy New Year to all, and look forward to working with all our colleagues. Have been trying to touch base with Senator Sass, and we'll look forward to having him here. This morning, the Finance Committee kicks off 2020 with the new NAFTA. The last few years have delivered one trade gut punch after another to America's exporters, particularly our farmers and our manufacturers. It began when then presidential candidate Trump talked about pulling the United States out of NAFTA, and that set the tone. It's been followed by the administration driving away a number of our traditional economic allies. 3 years of chaos, trade chaos, has hurt investment in America and caused farm bankruptcies to surge. Many foreign markets are more closed off to American exports today than they were on the day that the president took office. The Finance Committee now has an opportunity to provide a real measure of certainty and predictability to Americans who want to grow things here, who want to make things here, add value to them here, and ship those products around the world. That is what is on offer this morning. The new NAFTA makes a few key changes to our approach to trade that I'm going to address briefly. First, on the enforcement issue. Year after year, decade after decade, presidents and lawmakers of both political parties have paid lip service to the importance of enforcing trade laws. But all along, what this country did on enforcement was just too weakless. It didn't have any teeth, and it was too slow to protect American jobs from trade cheats. In my view, workers saw through all this lip service a long time ago. When the Trump administration sent up the first version of the new NAFTA agreement, it sure just looked like more of the status quo. It didn't cut it. The language that they offered on enforcement basically didn't enforce anything. It was just pretty much business as usual. So I, as the ranking Democrat on this side, reached out to our colleague from Ohio, Senator Brown, who has been a crusader for tough labor law enforcement as long as anybody in public life. We said we were going to fix it. And Senator Brown and I reached out to many of you. Many of us on this side contributed to the enforcement package. We talked to many on the other side. And Senator Brown and I developed a proposal that's all about putting more power directly in the hands of American workers and American businesses so they can fight back when they're getting ripped off by trade cheats. And it responds to what we actually heard in our communities. It's a whole lot faster than what we had before. It's a whole lot stronger than what we had before. And what Senator Brown and I came up with is about putting trade enforcement boots on the ground, helping to identify when factories in Mexico violate labor rules. Then our country can penalize the violators, protect the American jobs they tried to undercut. The enforcement process will take a fraction of the time it has in the past. No more forcing American businesses and workers to wait around for what seems like eons while trade cheats rip them off. So after Senator Brown and I did that, we took our proposal over to our colleagues in the House, and we made it clear we wanted to work with them, we wanted input, support, and after we did that, we went to the Trump administration and said, if you want our support on the new NAFTA, you've got to build on the tough trade enforcement proposal that we have been suggesting. We said this is a prerequisite. This tough trade law enforcement is a prerequisite to getting NAFTA done right. So when you combine this all-in approach on enforcement with new commitments on labor rights and environment, you also shut down the corporate race to the bottom on cheap wages and lax standards. It's about raising everybody else to our standards and taking action when they fall short. So I especially want to thank Senator Brown. I'm sure we'll hear from him for his leadership. And let me make clear that while he and I have our names on this enforcement package, I can look right down the row, literally, Senator Carper, Senator Bennett, every one of these colleagues contributed to this package, and I know a number of Republicans have an interest in these issues as well. I want to wrap up with some comments with respect to something nobody talked about when the first NAFTA came up, and that's technology and digital trade. Digital trade wasn't a part of the original NAFTA because it basically didn't exist when NAFTA was first negotiated. Everybody in this room carries a smartphone that would have met the definition of a supercomputer back in the early 1990s. But when it comes to rules regarding digital trade and tech, our trade laws have remained stuck in the mindset of decades ago. That is a problem today because the internet is now the shipping lane of the 21st century. Obviously, technology and digital trade are right at the center of a modern economy. They account for millions of good-paying jobs in our country. And most important, technology is woven into just about every major American industry. It's woven into autos, it's woven into manufacturing, healthcare, farming, you can go one after another. So when you talk about fighting for new rules on digital trade, you are talking about creating and protecting red, white, and blue jobs in a whole host of important, good-paying industries. The new NAFTA will fight back against trade cheats who want to eat the seed corn of this technological treasure trove, this innovation we have seen in tech. It'll do more to protect our intellectual property and protect American companies from being shaken down for their data. By including established law, colleagues, it will help guarantee that small technology entrepreneurs have a shot at building successful companies in a field now dominated by a small number of Goliaths. On agriculture, new NAFTA helps us send more of our dairy to Canada. More of our wine is going to make it to shelves in stores abroad. It ends harmful discrimination against wheat grown here. So these are all significant areas of improvement. In my home state, 1 out of 4 jobs revolves around trade. The trade jobs often pay better than do the non-trade jobs, and almost all of them are small and medium size. I want to wrap up with just 2 very quick points, Mr. Chairman. First, I think we all ought to thank Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, who I call the hardest working man in the trade agreement business. He has talked with a lot of us on multiple occasions. He is a straight shooter. You can't ask for more than that. And colleagues, I guess that's what you get when you have an alum of the Senate Finance Committee, a former staff director. I also want to I see Senator Sass been trying to call you and welcome you. We're glad you're here. And I'm going to close with just one last point. The legislation may be, this bill we're taking up today, may be the most significant economic issue the Senate addresses in 2020. Obviously, the Senate will also be holding an impeachment trial in the days ahead. Both of these are extraordinarily important matters that deserve to be addressed by the Senate with utmost seriousness. The new NAFTA agreement must not be used as a convenient excuse to shut down any other business before the Senate. Mr. Chairman, it's been a pleasure to work with you. We've got a lot to do in 2020. I'm looking forward to going ahead with our bipartisan healthcare efforts, for example. So we got a lot to do in 2020, and I thank you for arranging this morning.
But thank you very much for your cooperation. This is the order of the first 4 or 5 that I have on the list here. Mr. Crapo, and then Senator Menendez, Senator Roberts, Senator Carper. So now Senator Wyden, or Senator Crapo for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too welcome Senator Sass to the committee. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Wyden for your hard work on this. I also agree with both of your supportive comments. I want to thank Ambassador Lighthizer and President Trump for helping us get to this place as well. That we are voting today on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is welcome news. I've long maintained that the original North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, needed to be renegotiated. I had concerns with NAFTA because many goods and services originating in the United States received unfair treatment among our trading partners. It also did not provide sufficient market access, nor did it address pricing structures and restrictive trade practices in the dairy industry. President Trump and U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer forceful negotiations on behalf of America's farmers and workers fulfills one of the President's core campaign promises. Many Americans will see benefits of this updated trade deal with two of our country's three largest trading partners. The agreement is projected to raise U.S. real GDP by over $66 billion and create nearly 176,000 jobs. It will expand market access for U.S. farmers with new export opportunities for dairy, poultry, and egg producers. It addresses long-standing non-tariff barriers that restricted U.S. producers' ability to export wheat and wine to Canada. By requiring the use of scientific standards, it will prevent food safety and animal or plant measures from being used as protectionist trade restrictions. It eliminates Canada's Class 6 and 7 milk ingredient price programs that hindered U.S. exports to third country markets. These changes are predicted to increase U.S. dairy exports to Canada by $227 million and Mexico by $50.6 million. Total annual U.S. agriculture and food exports are expected to increase by $2.2 billion. These are just a few of the benefits that American business and rural communities stand to gain. Beyond the many improvements in the agricultural sector, USMCA will be the first U.S. free trade agreement with a digital trade chapter, creating a foundation to help spur the development of trade and investment in digital products and services. To that end, it will establish information sharing tools to help more than 120,000 American small and medium-sized businesses that export goods and services to Canada and Mexico take advantage of the USMCA. I applaud President Trump's decision to renegotiate this pact and commend the efforts of Ambassador Lighthizer to get this deal done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Menendez for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back when I served in the House of Representatives, I took a strong stand against NAFTA. I did so because NAFTA lacked strong, enforceable rules to protect workers and ensure that American families actually benefit from trade. I feared NAFTA would only intensify outsourcing of manufacturing jobs and contribute to stagnant wages for the American middle class. And unfortunately, I was right. So I was concerned that USMCA would repeat these same mistakes. But now, thanks to the work of congressional Democrats, USMCA includes upgraded rules to protect workers across the continent. And because of these improvements, I will support this agreement. However, this negotiation was not only a chance to right NAFTA's wrongs, it was an opportunity to lay the foundation for future growth in America's most competitive industries. Unfortunately, we didn't fully seize that opportunity. I'm disappointed that USMCA lacks strong intellectual property protections that promote innovative jobs in New Jersey and across the country. Future trade agreements must do more to encourage, protect, and reward American innovation. And finally, we have to be clear-eyed about the oversight that lies ahead of us to make our trade policy work for American families. This implementing bill gives USTR tremendous leeway to choose whether to enforce certain labor violations. It gives USTR the power to grant or deny individual automotive companies additional time to comply with the complex rules of origin. And these are serious concerns. Even beyond USMCA, we've seen the administration's trade policy sow confusion in other areas. A threat to put tariffs on Mexico over immigration, unclear criteria for our constituents seeking tariff exclusions, and a China deal that may or may not put an end to the intellectual property theft, cyber espionage, and government subsidies that have damaged America's economy for over a decade. We can debate whether these were the right policy choices, but we should all be able to agree that USTR must be transparent with the American people about the choices they make. So in order to do that, I plan to introduce a bill to establish an Inspector General for the USTR. Nearly every other cabinet-level agency has a statutory Inspector General to increase transparency, make government more accountable, and crack down on waste, fraud, and abuse. It's time USTR had one as well. And I look forward to working with members of the committee and you, Mr. Chairman, given your deep history on these issues, to bring a new era of accountability to our trade policy to the benefit of American workers and their families.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership, for your strong advocacy of the United States-Canada Trade Agreement, USMCA, which also stands for the United States Marine Corps always. I also want to recognize the efforts of Ambassador Lighthizer and Dowd. They worked overtime to get this done, and the whole team at the USTR. Crafting a final product that could gain the support of so many stakeholders is no easy task, especially in today's climate politically. I would just like to say on behalf of the farmers, ranchers, growers in Kansas and all over the country, they have made one thing very crystal clear over the past year: pass USMCA now. Times are challenging right now in farm country. They have been ever since 2014. We continue to be in a very rough patch. Now, we passed a farm bill a little more than a year ago to provide farmers and ranchers with the certainty and predictability they need to be successful producers. But as important as a farm bill is, I have heard from folks around the country, it is clear they need reliable markets, both domestically and abroad. And for this reason, I will be supporting the passage of USMCA. I want to say something about the original NAFTA agreement. Back in 2018, the two countries accounted for approximately 30% of the value of total U.S. agriculture exports. The value of U.S. agriculture exports to Canada in 2018 was over $20.8 billion, an increase of 276% since NAFTA was signed into law. For exports to Mexico, the value of U.S. agriculture has grown 316%, from $4.6 billion in 1994 to $19.1 billion in 2018. Seems to me that's pretty good for a trade act that has been described as the worst trade bill ever written. I have noticed that because I helped write the bill along with Kika de la Garza, the beloved chairman of the House Ag Committee at that time. And according to the U.S. International Trade Commission, the ITC, this is going to provide even more growth potential for America's future. Now, what I've been hearing from Kansans is what we need to do is get this trade bill done. Simply put, ASAP, get it done. If we are not leading the charge and setting the rules, other countries will, and they are. LBJ once said, sometimes you just have to hunker down like a jackass in a hailstorm. And that's just about the way our farmers have been doing for the last 4 years. I don't think we have to do that. I also do think it's good advice. There's a lot of trade cactus out there, trade tariff cactus. I just don't think it's a good idea that we try to sit on every damn one of them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to final passage of the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, USMCA.
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Now, Senator Carper for 3 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm reminded today, as we celebrate John Thune's 59th birthday, of an occasion that occurred in the White House. I was chairman of the National Governors Association. We had all the nation's governors gathered with President Clinton and his cabinet vice president Gore. And one of the things we talked about then was NAFTA and why was he interested in pursuing NAFTA. And what he said, he talked about World War II, the end of World War II. The rest of the world was on his back. And we were the 800-pound gorilla in the room. We allowed other nations to put up trade barriers to keep our goods and services out, and we allowed them to continue to sell to us largely without impediment. And he said the reason why we need NAFTA and other trade agreements is not to allow other countries to sell their stuff to us, but to make sure that our businesses have the opportunity to sell to them. And they put NAFTA in that context. And was it everything we hoped it would be? No. I like to say if it isn't perfect, make it better. It wasn't perfect, and we need to make it better. When our friend Robert Lighthizer was nominated to be the trade rep, he came to see all of us, and as he's going through the nominating process. And I suggested to him that he reach out to Michael Froman, trade rep during the Clinton administration. I said, Michael had been involved in negotiating something called Trans-Pacific Partnership. They had already negotiated pieces of that trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. 12 nations in all, 40% of the world's trade. And I said to Mr. Lighthizer, I said, before you go reinventing the wheel, find out what was negotiated in the last administration. I urged him to put Michael Froman on his speed dial, and as we went forward. And to his credit, they have communicated a lot in the last couple of years. I think it's been good for those negotiations. I wish we had not walked away. I wish the last administration or this administration hadn't pulled us out of TPP. I think that the idea that we were leading a 12-nation group for trading, we were the leader, 40% of the world's trade, China on the outside, looking in. And why we walked away from that agreement, I'm not sure. But we did, and now we have USMCA before us. And is it better than NAFTA? You bet it is. And we want to commend those who worked hard to make it better. Especially want to commend the trade rep, our trade rep, who does work hard. I want to commend a number of our colleagues, Sheridan, and our ranking member, Ron Wyden, and others, Democrats and Republicans, who worked hard. I want to thank especially Ben Cardin's not here yet, Sheldon's not here yet, but they work with me and others on the environmental provisions to make sure that they are enforceable, not just words on a piece of paper, but they are enforceable. I understand in the House with whom we worked on a number of these provisions, the House passed this bill by 385 to 41, bipartisan support, and I think this measure deserves that same kind of bipartisan support here. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Now, Senator Cornyn for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing's been a long time in the making, and I'm glad we're finally getting around to the USMCA. I want to commend the President and the U.S. Trade Representative for their hard work and determination in achieving this goal despite consistent political headwinds. I also want to thank Chairman Grass and his staff for considering an issue important to my state in the committee report involving a product called Sotol. I believe that the provisions in the agreement, absent some clarification in the committee report, would contravene congressional intent that prohibits deception of consumers with respect to distilled spirits products. And so we'll look forward to working with the chairman and the House on that port language. As a Texan, I've long understood and appreciated the close economic relationship with our neighbors to the north and the south. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that NAFTA supports about 13 million jobs in the United States. In 2018, Texas exported more than $137 billion in goods and services to Canada and Mexico. This trade supports an estimated 950,000 jobs in Texas and has helped make our state's economy the 10th largest in the world, not just in the country, but in the world. Much of this was made possible because of NAFTA, which, as we know, took effect a quarter of a century ago. And a lot has happened since that time. As beneficial as NAFTA has been in creating positive changes, we can all agree it's time for an update, and that's precisely what the USMCA will do. It brings NAFTA into the 21st century. It will provide economic certainty, reduce tariffs, and a greater opportunity for all sectors, including our farmers, ranchers, and producers, manufacturers, and goods and services. It will provide needed infrastructure along the border as well. I worked closely with Ambassador Lighthizer and the administration to secure funding for the North American Development Bank, which I'm glad was included in the agreement. This will provide $215 million to strengthen infrastructure and improve quality of life in our border communities as well as those of our neighbors. Mr. Chairman, while I'm sympathetic to a number of the issues that I believe our friend, the senator from Pennsylvania, will raise here, I do believe that this is a good agreement. It is not a perfect agreement, and on net, I think it deserves my support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Now, Senator Senator Brown for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As many members of this committee know, I voted no 25 years ago on NAFTA and have voted against every trade agreement since, because every trade agreement has been written by corporations to maximize corporate profits and to reward corporate executives, always at the expense of workers, always at the expense of the middle class. We've seen the consequences, a shrinking middle class, an economy that works for corporations, but for fewer and fewer workers, especially in the industrial Midwest. President Trump's initial draft of this agreement was just more of the same, another pro-corporate trade deal written by special interests. But Ranking Member Wyden and I fought for changes alongside Speaker Pelosi and labor leaders that make real and important steps toward putting workers at the center of our trade policy. We know why corporations move jobs overseas. They can pay lower wages, they can exploit workers. The only way to stop that race to the bottom is by raising labor standards in every country we trade with. That's why Ranking Member Wyden and I authored a completely new way of holding corporations accountable, our Brown-Wyden worker protection provision. For the first time ever, a worker in Mexico can report through an anonymous hotline that her employer is violating her right to form a union, and within months we can take action against the company. Brown-Wyden is the first improvement to enforcing the labor standards in our trade agreement since we've been negotiating trade agreements. And when Mexican workers have the power to form real unions and to negotiate for higher wages, it helps American workers. Right now, Mexican workers can be paid as little as $6.50 a day, not an hour, a day. And we've been asking American workers to compete with that. We've already heard some critics say Brown-Wyden will force Mexican wages to rise. To that, I plead guilty. That's the entire point, to take away the incentive for American companies to shut down production in Mansfield and Cleveland and Dayton and move those jobs to Mexico. I want to especially again thank Chairman Wyden. Without him endorsing this proposal and pushing it aggressively in the face of an administration that simply didn't want to write strong labor standards, and Senator Wyden and I and Speaker Pelosi and labor movement made the president and Mr. Lighthizer understand there was no agreement unless workers were at the center of the agreement. I'd also like to thank Nora Todd and my staff for her unrelenting work for years, often thinking we were in the wilderness, but coming forward and making this happen. We must be straight with American workers. One deal that Democrats fixed is not going to bring back auto plants like the president promises. I have real concerns that the auto rules of origin are much weaker than the administration says. I ask the chairman and the ranking member to commit to working with me to ensure companies actually comply with these rules and to strengthen them if we need to. And we still have more work to do to make our trade agreements more pro-worker. I'm voting yes for the first time on a trade agreement because by including Brown-Wyden, Democrats have made this agreement, Democrats in the labor movement, much more pro-worker and set an important precedent that Brown-Wyden must be included in every single future trade agreement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Brown, thank you. Now Senator Bennett.
Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Wyden for holding this markup and for your leadership on this matter. Trade with Canada and Mexico is vital for our country's economy and certainly for Colorado's economy, from businesses on the Front Range to farmers and ranchers on the West Slope and the Eastern Plains. Last year alone, we exported $2.7 billion in goods and services to Canada and Mexico. While NAFTA helped establish these trading partnerships, I've long said that we should modernize NAFTA as our economy develops. While President Trump's initial effort fell short, the work that Senator Brown and Senator Wyden did to fill the gap, assuring more resources and more tools to hold our trading partners accountable on labor and on the environment. I'm thankful for the work on both sides of the aisle to get us to this point, and I support USMCA because it not only maintains key export markets for Colorado, it brings North American trade into the 21st century. At the same time, we have to be honest. Passing the USMCA will not ease the enormous pain and uncertainty from the administration's feckless trade policy over the last 3 years. Every day, the president's unpredictable behavior casts a shadow of uncertainty over consumers, small businesses, and agricultural producers. This year alone, Mr. Chairman, there's an increase of farm bankruptcies by 23%. Farm incomes have fallen, and what they're exporting overseas has dropped like a stone. Every day, farmers and ranchers are left to wonder if the president's next tweet will collapse the value of crops they've already planted. And unlike this administration, they know that future growth will come from new, fast-growing overseas markets. Instead of securing those markets, the president is ceding them to foreign competitors while forcing hardworking Americans to bear the costs of his tariffs and trade bill. So while I'm grateful that Congress is taking swift action to pass USMCA, today's vote is not enough. We must do more to grow export opportunities and lift up standards around the world. And this administration must act responsibly for the sake of American workers, farmers, ranches, and businesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and now it looks to me like we have Thune, Portman, and then Warner.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This markup has been a long time coming for the farmers and ranchers of my home state of South Dakota and around the country who are struggling. Today we have an opportunity to move forward on a trade deal, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, that would hopefully bring them some relief. Thanks to low commodity prices and livestock prices, natural disasters, and protracted trade disputes, farmers and ranchers in my state of South Dakota and around the country have had a tough few years. When I talk to farmers and ranchers at home in South Dakota, they continue to emphasize that the most important thing that Washington can do to boost our agricultural economy is to take action on trade agreements to expand markets. Farmers and ranchers need access to new and expanded markets for their products, and they need certainty about what international markets are going to look like in the future. USMCA will help meet those needs. It will preserve and expand farmers' access to two critical export markets, and it will give farmers certainty about what those markets will look like long term. I'm particularly pleased with the improvements the agreement makes for U.S. dairy products. South Dakota has experienced a major dairy expansion over the past few years, and this agreement will benefit U.S. dairy producers by substantially expanding market access in Canada, where U.S. dairy sales have been restricted. The U.S. International Trade Commission estimates that the agreement will boost U.S. dairy exports by more than $277 million. The agreement will also expand market access for U.S. poultry and egg producers, and it will make it easier for U.S. producers to export wheat to Canada. And of course, the benefits for the agriculture industry are just one part of this agreement. Virtually every sector of our economy will benefit from the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, from manufacturing to digital services to the automotive industry. And it should come as no surprise, then, that the USMCA will create 176,000 jobs and increase wages for workers. Now, this is not to say that I don't think the administration could and should have gone further in certain areas. For example, as a consistent supporter of country of origin labeling, I wish the administration had been able to find a solution to restore COOL, add value to our domestic ag products, and to eliminate the risk of future trade sanctions. But we cannot let the perfect become the enemy of the good. There are thousands of farmers and ranchers in my state and around the country who are waiting for the relief that this agreement will bring. It is past time to pass this trade deal. I will be voting yes on USMCA, and I would encourage my colleagues on this committee and in the United States Senate to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Thune. Now, Senator Portman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to particularly commend the team at USTR for negotiating this. Bob Lighthizer is not with us this morning because he's working on the next agreement, but it's great to have some of the staff here. I want to particularly point out John Melly, who's a professional staffer with whom I had the opportunity and the privilege to work when I was at USTR, and he was the chief staff negotiator. This has been over 2 years of hard work. Frankly, it sat up in the House for over a year. It's exciting that we're finally here, and we're going to get this done because it's good for Ohio and it's good for America. It also is important to me that there was a strong vote in the House because it shows that trade can be bipartisan and that we do have a consensus in this country that we want to export more. We want to do more trading because trading is good for our country. I support USMCA because I believe it is a pro-trade agreement. It opens new markets. That was talked about earlier. John Thune just talked about its benefits for agriculture. That's certainly true, but also in other ways. It reduces trade uncertainty with the first ever digital trade chapter for NAFTA. Really important because this is increasingly part of trade, particularly in Ohio. We've got a lot of internet companies that are going to be
benefited by this. It also eases the customs burden for small sellers by raising the protectionist de minimis caps in Canada and Mexico. We should have been able to do even more, but this is great success. And again, congratulations on what I know is some tough negotiating there. That helps a lot of our small businesses in Ohio. I've already mentioned the internet economy rules that avoid the kind of digital protectionism that otherwise could happen, but also this level the playing field issue that was talked about earlier. My colleague from Ohio and others have talked about this. The rules of origin is really important to Ohio. We're the #2 auto state in the country. Auto manufacturing has become increasingly high-tech. And these rules of origin for cars are important because they've begun to leak as parts have come in from China and, frankly, other countries that have been free riders on the NAFTA preference. So I think that's appropriate. I don't know why it's considered to be inappropriate to say, look, if you have an agreement with the United States, well, we'll give you this preference. If you don't have an agreement, you can't free ride on our agreement by coming in. And frankly, what it's going to do is encourage other countries to have trade agreements with us. So I think it's a good thing for expanding trade. The rules of origin also require that 70% of the steel in vehicles made in North America are made in North America. That's the first time ever as well. And I think that's also important. And this is all in USMCA, but not in NAFTA. The NAFTA labor and environmental standards have been talked about. They were promises on paper, but not enforceable under NAFTA. Now they are enforceable. It updates the standards as well, which hasn't been talked about as much, and that's important, just to bring a 25-year-old agreement up to speed. We had to do that. So, look, is it perfect? No, no agreement's perfect, but this is a big improvement. And a vote for NAFTA is a vote for these improvements. A vote against it, of course, is a vote for the status quo. I'm pleased that Sharon and Gary Pinus, who are in Columbus, Ohio, who have contacted me, are now going to be able to, in their budding eBay business, to be able to have more access to Canada and Mexico, our biggest trading partners from Ohio by far. I'm pleased that Frank Burkett, who's contacted me, who's a dairy farmer whose farm I visited in Canal Fulton, Ohio, is going to be able to sell more to Canada and get his prices up. I'm pleased that our auto workers around our state are going to have a more level playing field. This is all critical and all why I think it's so important that we do move forward with this agreement today. So again, congratulations, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to being a yes today and to getting this onto the Senate floor as soon as possible.
Now, Senator Warner for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we all know, strong trading relationships improve our nation's economy. I'm optimistic that this trade agreement will help American farmers, ports, manufacturers, retailers, and workers. As others have pointed out, this deal addresses issues like digital trade that NAFTA couldn't fully anticipate and decreases market barriers to agricultural products that have been huge points of concern for Virginia farmers. I want to add my colleagues' congratulations to Ranking Member Wyden and my friend Senator Brown and our House colleagues, because now this agreement finally includes strong labor protections to ensure that companies in our partner nations are held accountable and that American workers can compete on a level playing field. Overall, I'm hopeful this agreement will provide the consistency and stability that the business community needs. At the same time, I worry that the process that led us to this point may result in reduced U.S. credibility and trust from our allies and closest trading partners. Throughout the negotiation process, the President's efforts to levy tariffs on Canada and Mexico and to make repeated threats to withdraw from NAFTA or to heedlessly close the border with Mexico have exemplified the troubling and erratic approach to trade issues that we've seen from the administration. Our trade relationships are a key form of diplomacy, allowing us to increase U.S. influence abroad and deepen our relationships with foreign partners in ways that benefit not just American prosperity, but U.S. security and leadership. Alienating our closest allies with the misuse of national security tariffs is counterproductive and endangers American security. That's why Senator Toomey and I have offered the Bicameral Trade Authority Act to curb abuses of the 232 authority. I'm hopeful that with ratification of this deal, this committee will have an opportunity to re-examine those efforts in a bipartisan fashion. Finally, and I made an agreement with the ranking member not to raise this issue during these considerations, but I do want to take note that I have serious concerns with the inclusion of safe harbor language modeled on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Congress is beginning at this point an important bipartisan debate about whether Section 230 is working as intended, and many, including many prominent civil rights groups, believe that Section 230 has allowed Internet intermediaries to ignore misuse of their platforms by bad actors. This is an issue that I think needs our attention and that I hope that we can revisit in a bipartisan way. Again, I commend everybody who worked on this, and as I mentioned earlier, you know, it's going to be unique to follow Sherrod Brown on a trade piece of legislation.
Thank you, Senator Warner. Now Senator Langford. Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. About 3 years ago, President Trump announced that he was going to revisit NAFTA. And a lot of folks around the country that have benefited from NAFTA long term looked at it with a little bit of a nervous eye. NAFTA has put, for the last 25 years, a really good playing field for having low or no tariffs across North America. And what we've seen is billions of dollars in trade in Canada and Mexico being by far our largest trading partners. Over the last 2.5 years, Trump administration, through their negotiations and through a lot of word through the media back and forth of what's going to happen or what's not going to happen at the end of the day, have actually locked in a trade deal. It is a bipartisan trade deal. It is a message to every other country around the world that the United States is going to be a tough trading partner to be able to get into negotiations. But at the end of it, we want to get into an actual trade deal and to get something signed and done. My conversations with the president over the last 2.5 years have circled over and over again, is your goal to have high tariffs, or is your goal to have low or no tariffs? And again, he has repeated to me privately, and again, he has stated in different ways publicly, his goal is to get to low or no tariffs so that we can open up trade, but it has to be a fair process at the end of the day. This revision of NAFTA gets us back to an agreement with Canada and Mexico that gets back to low or no tariffs across North America. It takes the vast majority of the existing zero tariff treatment from NAFTA, forwards that, and deals with some of the issues that we've dealt with in Oklahoma for a long time, like wheat. When you drive across the western and northern part of my state, you see beautiful wheat fields. Those beautiful wheat fields feed our kids, feed our families. But when they go into Canada, Canada has a different way of grading that wheat that drops the price there and has been a problem for Oklahoma farmers for a very long time. This deal finally deals with the wheat issue that we've had in Oklahoma for a long time with NAFTA. This deals with digital trade. It deals with intellectual property. It deals with multiple other updates to agricultural goods like dairy and eggs and poultry, things that are exceptionally important that finally get resolved. So there's a lot of good that's in this. I'm glad they've kept a lot of the things that have been beneficial in NAFTA in the past and have done a sufficient update to this in the days ahead because it desperately needed an update. And after 2.5 years of consternation across the country of will we actually get a trade agreement done, we're actually getting a trade agreement done, and I hope it sets a platform for every other country negotiating with us to say we actually want to get trade agreements done and to get everyone to the table and get something finalized. So with that, I thank the chairman. There's a lot of this that I would have done very, very differently, but I'm glad that we're sending a message worldwide that we're open to trade again.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Now Senator Hassan.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Wyden, for holding this markup to consider the trade agreement among the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, known as the USMCA. International trade, when done right, helps businesses and consumers alike by expanding opportunity, reducing costs, and boosting economic growth. In evaluating any trade deal, including the USMCA, I use two key benchmarks. First, trade deals must help level the playing field for New Hampshire's and our country's innovative businesses that are competing in the global economy. And second, trade deals must contain strong enforcement mechanisms that protect workers, consumers, and the environment. Thanks to the diligence and good faith efforts of both Democratic and Republican negotiators, the bipartisan USMCA now meets both of these standards, and I support implementing this agreement. In terms of competition, the USMCA boosts American businesses by modernizing our current trade agreement, which predated internet commerce, to protect the flow of digital trade and to better safeguard intellectual property. The agreement also cuts red tape for small exporters by allowing electronic filing of customs forms, an important provision for a small business state like New Hampshire. In addition to cutting red tape, the deal cuts costs for small businesses by increasing the share of shipments to Canada and Mexico with duty-free status. Further, the USMCA removes long-standing trade barriers that have prevented dairy farmers in New Hampshire and other states from accessing the Canadian market. When it comes to enforcement, the bipartisan deal that Democrats negotiated with the administration contains major improvements to the agreement. First off, I want to commend Senators Brown and Wyden on their efforts to ensure that the agreement contains strong labor enforcement mechanisms, which helps remove incentives that would otherwise encourage the outsourcing of jobs. The bipartisan agreement also helps protect consumers from soaring pharmaceutical prices by eliminating provisions that would have shielded brand-name drugs from competition. And the USMCA contains funding for environmental protection and measures to help ensure that the administration follows through with enforcement of environmental provisions. I'd like to commend Senator Carper for his work on developing and incorporating those provisions in the agreement. The bipartisan USMCA will work to increase the competitiveness of American businesses while ensuring the protections in the agreement are effectively enforced. And I will vote in committee and on the Senate floor to support the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Now, Senator Daines.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Today marks a very important step for farmers, for ranchers, and small businesses across Montana, as well as around our country. Advancing this important trade deal between the United States, Canada, and Mexico out of the Senate Finance Committee will bring us one step closer to providing more certainty and better access to markets for Montana agriculture. I think it's worth noting, you look at the top 4 largest trading partners of the United States in terms of just dollars. It's China, Canada, Mexico, Japan. It's important to stay focused on these large trading partners. We got the good deal with Japan done recently. The Phase 1 China deal is imminent. And now we're going to be moving forward here with Canada and Mexico. This is progress. You think about that 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. As I think about my farmers and ranchers back home, it's all about access to these markets. I'm grateful to see us making progress in that regard. My farmers and ranchers across Montana consistently tell me about the importance of trade and the need to move this critical agreement forward. I repeatedly called on Congress to take action on this trade deal. I'm glad to see it near the finish line. You see, in Montana, ag is more than just our #1 driver of the Montana economy. It is very much our very way of life in Montana, and this agreement will help ensure we maintain critical access to Canada's and Mexico's important markets, that we can maintain it and, importantly, expand it. This trade is expected to create almost 180,000 new American jobs, boost our economy by more than $70 billion in GDP. In fact, in 2018 alone, Montana had $731 million in total exports to Canada as well as Mexico. For our producers and our ag-related industries in Montana, this would help provide certainty and alleviate some of the challenges and obstacles they faced over a very tough season back home in Montana. Additionally, not only advancing USMCA will improve our trading relationships with Canada and Mexico, it also allows for more focus and energy to be placed on opening these new markets for Montana ag, energy, and our small businesses. Ongoing efforts to level the playing field and reduce barriers to trade in China, the EU, Japan, and other critical markets continues to be essential, and I will continue to work with the chairman and the administration to get it done. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and I look forward to supporting it today and voting for it on the Senate floor soon.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, and Ambassador Lighthizer. I want to begin by thanking you and your staff for all of the good work that and literally tireless work that you have done to negotiate a bipartisan agreement that begins to provide certainty to our businesses here and at home in Nevada. Trade is one of the top concerns I hear from Nevadans. During my time in the Senate, I have heard directly from around 100 business owners in all 17 counties in my state, including the dairy industry, that say they need stability. Nevada exports over $1.8 billion in goods to Canada and Mexico, which creates thousands of American jobs in my home state. And Nevadans need a fair trade deal that protects workers and provides businesses of all sizes the ability to plan so that they can grow. Nevadans are concerned with tariffs, market access, a trade war with China, and this USMCA agreement. Here in Washington, I believe we have been making some progress in a bipartisan way to improve and modernize some of these trade agreements. However, I remain concerned that the president and his policymaking by tweet undercuts the effective bipartisan work that is being done. It impacts markets and the ability of Nevada businesses to plan for the future. And Nevada's workers should have a peace of mind that their jobs won't be threatened by erratic policymaking in Washington. During this process, I made it very clear I supported the incorporation of the Wyden-Brown proposal, and I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Wyden and Senator Brown, for fighting to incorporate this proposal into the trade agreement. I am thankful we were able to come to a bipartisan compromise and include important labor protections and enforcement provisions. I am proud of Nevada's strong tradition of organized labor. That is why I understand how important it is to protect and fight for unions, to strengthen their bargaining rights so that working families can organize for safer workplaces and better wages. I vowed to fight to ensure workers' rights are protected in any trade deal. Because labor was at the table when these deals were negotiated, we were able to come to an acceptable agreement. I'm also pleased to see in this trade deal that the dairy industry in Nevada will benefit as well. I acknowledge that this deal is not perfect. It alone will not solve outsourcing and economic inequality. I know our friends in the environmental community have concerns about this agreement falling short on addressing the climate crisis. I share their sentiment that this administration has repeatedly failed to address or acknowledge the climate crisis. That is just one of the reasons why I will continue to fight for real investment in renewable energy technologies and the protection of our precious natural resources and the environment. These concerns need to continue to be addressed, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to address these concerns. Overall, I am pleased to be able to support this bipartisan trade agreement today. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Now, Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's worth starting with a reminder of how we got this process started. NAFTA is, after all, a free and fair and reciprocal trade agreement. There are 0 tariffs on 100% of manufactured goods that trade across our borders, 0 tariffs on 97% of agricultural products, and very, very few obstructions of other forms. Now, NAFTA needed to be updated because it's an old agreement and the economy has changed. But that's not the real reason that this agreement was renegotiated. The real reason was because we have a trade deficit with Mexico, and the administration deemed that to be unacceptable. So I think it's useful to think about USMCA as consisting of NAFTA with primarily 2 categories of changes. One is a category of changes that modernize it, takes into effect and basically codifies existing practices in the digital economy. But the second category are the changes that are meant to diminish trade and investment. And this, my colleagues, is what I think is wrong with this agreement. It's the first time we're ever going to go backwards on a trade agreement. The country-specific rules of origins are completely antithetical to a continental free trade agreement and designed to raise the cost to American consumers of buying Mexican cars. The sunset clause, this thing goes poof in 16 years, it's gone. That is designed to have a chilling effect on investment. The ISDS mechanism, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, is gone virtually in this agreement. And the new negotiations that came in the last few months, labor provisions and the removal of the intellectual property protections for biologics, I think also take us backwards. Be careful about the ITC report. There's no economic growth here. There's a little tiny bit of growth that they attribute to the codification of the existing trade practices in digital technology, but they acknowledge that the trade restricting provisions will diminish jobs and economic growth. And they don't even attempt to quantify the adverse effect of the sunset clause. Finally, on process, in significant ways, it seems to me that this committee is getting rolled, and we shouldn't do that. We're being made increasingly irrelevant in a process of trade negotiation, which is a constitutional responsibility assigned to us. TPA is a delegated authority to the administration, and this agreement, Mr. Chairman, in my view, is not in compliance with TPA. Case in point, an example here is we're not having a mock markup today. As we all know, This is not a mock-up of a draft implementing legislation. This bill was already passed by the House. There's no amendments going to be permitted. No changes can be made. And in the past, every single trade agreement has come before this committee with a mock markup for the express purpose of allowing us to discover whether there's a consensus about some changes, which could be recommended to the administration in the form of amendments, and which could then be incorporated in a final draft. All of that is being dispensed with. So, Mr. Chairman, in my view, we've taken a free trade agreement that needed modernization, and there is modernization, but then we've slapped on all of these provisions designed to restrict trade and investment. We'll get no economic growth out of this, and we, the Senate, and the Senate Finance Committee are allowing ourselves to be marginalized. This should not be a template for going forward. And since it's not compliant with TPA rules, it seems to me it ought to be considered under regular order, where, by the way, there's plenty of votes to pass it under regular order. I think for the sake of the integrity of TPA and for legislative filibuster, we should not consider this under TPA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Now it'll be Senator Casey, and I'm going to step out for a minute, so after Casey's 3 minutes are up, Senator Sass is up.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. As the Auditor General of Pennsylvania way back in the 1990s, I opposed NAFTA. That was in 1997, to be specific. In the interim period, as a public official in our state, I fought a lot of battles for workers and for worker rights. When President Trump came into office in 2017, I was somewhat hopeful that he would stay true to his word on trade. However, in 2018, he signed a corporate trade deal, which only was improved, I should say, by the Herculean efforts by Democrats and by the men and the women of organized labor. I applaud those efforts over many, many months now, and I'll support this agreement. We must be clear-eyed, though, about what this agreement doesn't do and what it does do and what it doesn't do. This agreement will not fix outsourcing. It will not do nearly enough to bring jobs home or rebuild our communities, which have been devastated by trade over time. But this agreement is a measurable improvement on the status quo and represents a step forward in what trade proposals of the future should look like. I applaud the work of Speaker Pelosi, Senator Brown, Senator Wyden, and other members of this committee who have fought to get this to a better place on NAFTA rewrite. Our state of Pennsylvania has paid a high price when it comes to trade, and we must continue to move forward to ensure the mistakes of the past aren't repeated and new mistakes are not made. For example, the Economic Policy Institute estimates that NAFTA eliminated 850,000 jobs nationally, most of them in manufacturing. According to a 2015 Economic Policy Institute report, Pennsylvania lost 314,000 manufacturing jobs, 5.7% of total employment between 1998 and 2013. 314,000 manufacturing jobs. The President said he's for workers, but he seems to work only for corporations. Make no mistake about it, Democrats and labor unions are the reason this agreement has enforceable labor standards. Democrats and labor unions are the only reason this agreement has enforceable standards on the environment. Just as it is clear the President's track record on workers and families, President Trump gave large multinational corporations tax incentives to offshore manufacturing jobs. He eliminated the deduction for union dues. He is trying to decimate the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and he's appointed anti-worker corporate judges to virtually every level of our nation's judiciary. This agreement that we're considering now is, as I said, a measurable improvement. Unfortunately, the agreement the President signed in October of 2018 contained zero improvements to trade enforcement and was deficient in both labor and environmental protections. Democratic efforts made today's vote possible, and I applaud those efforts. Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman. I'll move on.
Thank you for your efforts on the labor protections as well. Senator Sass for his first day here and his opening address to the committee.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Opening address feels a little too august, but to you and the Chairman, thanks for inviting me. To all of you on the committee, you know there are good reasons why this is regularly referred to as the most powerful committee in the Congress. The work here affects moms and dads, farmers and ranchers, patients and doctors, taxpayers, present and future. And so, Chairman, thank you for having me serve on this committee and for your welcome, and it's good to follow you in your chairmanship on a second committee. I'm also extremely eager to have my first vote on this committee be the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. The USMCA should have been done a long, long time ago. It languished in the House for reasons that aren't really that defensible, but it's great that we're finally going to have the opportunity to vote on this trade agreement. Senator Toomey made a bunch of important comments that I agree with as well, and yet we need to, given political realities, get this agreement across the finish line. The USMCA comes at a critical time for Nebraska agriculture. Here's the bad news. Farmers have experienced low commodity prices, excessive supply, weather disasters, global trade disruptions, and the farm economy, as the senator from Kansas has said, is embarrassingly sluggish. But here's the good news. The USMCA trade agreement strengthens our trading relationships with North American neighbors. It is also the foundation for some future trade agreements in terms of modernization of rules and regulations, laws and obligations with conformity, transparency, and verification. According to the USDA Economic Research Service, Nebraska exported almost $7 billion of agricultural commodities in 2018. That puts Nebraska sixth in the nation in trade in ag exports, behind California, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Texas. If you know your demography, Nebraska is by far the lowest population state of those big six. So the value of Nebraska exports consistently accounts for 30% of our state's total agricultural receipts. The USMCA trade agreement provides security, market access, long-term stability and growth, not only in quantity, but also in the value of our products sold to North American trading partners. This agreement further lays the foundation for future agreements for protection against foul play from China. More mutually beneficial trading agreements will strengthen our position against exploitative trade practices that undermine American influence worldwide. So, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, I am proud of the efforts by the U.S. Trade Representative. Ambassador Lighthizer is away on different work, but as one of only 2 Republicans who voted against his confirmation, because I have a more pro-free trade view than the ambassador on a lot of issues, I want to compliment him and his team on the way they have dialogued with us and worked with us. The ambassador has been a prince of a man in terms of his willingness to engage and educate and tutor. So here's the bottom line. Nebraska is ready to keep feeding the world, and we need open trade markets to do so. We should get the job done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Young for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. As all my colleagues have iterated, I'm pleased we've come to this moment in the Finance Committee. It's taken a bit longer than many of us would have liked, and I hope in the future free trade agreements can be considered more expeditiously. But nonetheless, here we have this agreement, USMCA, and while not perfect, I know how critical USMCA is for the state of Indiana and for our entire country, for farm country, for manufacturers, and for businesses of all sizes. In my state, trade certainty with Canada and Mexico is vital. Over 233,000 jobs are directly attributable to our trade with Canada and Mexico. Our exports total $19 billion worth of goods and services, with transportation equipment and chemicals and machinery among the largest export categories. Our auto exports to Canada and Mexico have significantly increased in recent years. Since 2010, they have more than doubled. But what's really important is that over 70% of transportation equipment exports come directly from small and medium-sized enterprises. By facilitating an environment that enhances market access to our largest trading partners, we support these local businesses that truly invest in workers through higher wages and other benefits, and we thereby strengthen our local communities. USMCA gives farmers much-needed tools through eliminating unnecessary market barriers, expanding market access, and improving processes around biotech approvals. Hoosier farmers benefit from a reliable trading relationship with our neighbors, especially as the future remains uncertain with many countries. For these reasons and for many others, I will be supporting USMCA. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The state of Washington is one of the most trade-dependent economies in our country, and we certainly believe in opening new markets. And this agreement, while I could focus today on wheat, dairy, and the digital aspects, or the need to have better enforcement on aerospace, I want to spend my time talking about the $240 million we're going to spend on ensuring that Mexico has capacity building protections. That is, for rights to organize and bargain collectively. I want to thank my colleagues, Senator Brown and Wyden, for helping to implement these provisions on enforcement, but also recognizing that the twin sister of enforcement is capacity building. Why do I believe that we need to focus on capacity building? When we passed the Customs Bill for Trade Promotion Authority, we created a $30 million enforcement trust fund. That trust fund has been used to bolster agriculture, our economy, by also being used to stop illegal logging in South America, to send Chinese a warning about tariffs and quotas on wheat, and to get that changed, and to fight European subsidies for commercial aircraft. So that capacity that we put into the customs bill has helped us make trade work. The same thing is clear here. If we want to make trade work in countries that don't really understand how to make it work successfully, we can demand all we want, but the United States of America has to be a willing partner in building capacity. So why do I think this is so important? Well, it's a roadmap for where we need to go. This is the first time that I know of where business and labor, companies like Coca-Cola and the AFL-CIO, are in agreement about how to make the rules of the road. They are saying specifically, we believe in the United States of America helping these countries build the judicial system, the labor enforcement system, the protection against child labor violations, and all the things that are so important to make a good trading partner. This is a far cry from building a wall. So in a lot of ways, this bill is a lot more Trumpka than it is Trump. And this is the point I want to make this morning. If our country wants to recognize the growing middle class around the world, the huge economic opportunity that the tipping point has occurred, there are more middle class people than poor people now in the global economy. It's trillions of dollars of economic opportunity. So let's build relationships, let's build enforcement, let's build capacity, and let's get on with what my state already knows, that trade is a great economic opportunity for our future economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. As I often say in Michigan, we make things and grow things. Because we make things and grow things, trade is a critical part of our economy, and we are clearly a border state. Trade is particularly critical with Mexico and Canada, our two largest trading partners. For a trade agreement to be effective for American families, we need to make sure we're exporting our products and not our jobs, and that's the test for me. Unfortunately, since NAFTA went into effect for more than 2 decades, workers and families in Michigan have seen manufacturing jobs and their livelihoods outsourced to Mexico. NAFTA created a race to the bottom, major incentives for companies to ship their manufacturing jobs and facilities to Mexico so they could pay the lowest wage and offer the lowest benefits possible. When the Trump administration announced they would renegotiate NAFTA, I agreed that a review and a modernization was long overdue. However, when the administration announced that they had reached a deal in 2018, they touted a new agreement that was essentially the old NAFTA for working men and women. There was still no meaningful enforcement to guarantee a level playing field, and it was clear to me that Michigan workers had been betrayed. So I did not support that agreement. Instead, I joined with Democratic colleagues led by Senator Brown, Senator Wyden, who have done excellent work, to dramatically improve the agreement and add more tools on leveling the playing field for workers and protecting American jobs. Because of these substantial improvements, I now intend to support this agreement. But it's not enough to have words on a piece of paper. These new enforcement tools must be used. It's up to the administration and to Congress to vigorously monitor and enforce this agreement. We need a fair trading system that actually addresses labor, environmental, and other violations swiftly when they occur. For example, we were also able to end Canada's Class 7 milk pricing scheme, an issue I've worked on for a long time, and I want to thank Ambassador Lighthizer for his efforts in making this a priority. This pricing scheme allows Canada to manipulate the price of their milk, which in turn lowers the demand for U.S. milk exports. Enforcement of this new language is critical for American dairy producers. Again, making sure Canada abides by their obligations on dairy and ensuring Mexico follows through on their constitutional reforms will only be successful if the new enforcement tools Democrats secured are actually used. I also want to take a moment to say what is not in this agreement and the work that still needs to be done for American workers and families. We should be passing legislation like my Bring Jobs Home Act to close loopholes that reward companies when they offshore American jobs. It's also critical, Mr. Chairman, that we make updates to trade adjustment assistance to support Americans who lose their jobs because of trade impacts. Soon I will be introducing a trade adjustment assistance reauthorization bill to modernize, reform, and strengthen TAA for workers who continue to be harmed by unfair trade practices. Usually, trade adjustment assistance moves as part of a trade agreement, as we know. Because this is not happening with USMCA, I urge that we support displaced workers, that they be a priority for future action in this committee. Again, on behalf of the people of Michigan, I'm laser focused on making sure we're exporting products, not jobs, and this bipartisan agreement creates the tools to do that if we use them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. I will be a no vote on environmental concerns. I recognize that a lot of progress has been made in this agreement on trade and labor issues, and I want to thank, on our side particularly, Ranking Member Wyden and Senator Brown for the impressive work that they have done to make those improvements. There's actually even been a lot of progress made on environmental issues, and I want to thank Senators Carper and Cardin for their hard work there. But the progress that's been made on environmental issues started from an embarrassingly, really disgracefully low bar, non-existent bar. So this agreement does not reflect a sense of urgency about what I feel is an appropriately sense of dread about the climate calamities that are unfolding. The wildfires now burning in Australia, the trillions of gallons shedding off the Greenland ice cap. The Earth is sending us profound signals that we have knocked things out of whack on our only home. My state of Rhode Island is facing a new map because sea level rise will force that change. The USMCA does not even mention climate change. That name, that word, that phrase does not even appear. The question for me is, does this agreement work toward protecting us from warming above 1.5 degrees centigrade, or does it not? And in my view, it does not. We have never had CO2 levels on this planet at the levels we see now in the entire history of our human species. It breaks my heart to see Congress sleepwalking into catastrophe on carbon emissions. And it angers my heart to see the fossil fuel industry still so deliberately incapacitating us from taking necessary action. So, for these reasons, sadly, I will vote no.
Okay, thank you. Now, Senator Whitehouse, now Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and your staff for your hard work and dedication on this deal. It is certainly not a perfect deal and not necessarily the deal that I would like us to be discussing today, but it certainly is a step in the right direction. South Carolina is a great case study in the effects of a post-NAFTA world. Our textile community was decimated in many ways from our perspective because of NAFTA. The good news is we had an opportunity to recreate our economy, and we recreated our economy around high-tech manufacturing. And today, in South Carolina, companies like BMW, Bosch, Michelin, and Volvo have all made South Carolina their home. FDI, or foreign direct investment, is a major part of the lifeblood of the South Carolina economy. BMW just recently celebrated 25 years of presence in South Carolina. That's 25 years, $11 billion invested, 11,000 workers, 4% of our state employees are a part of the automotive industry. So as this committee considers this agreement, this administration and future administrations must remember that innovation is what drives America to greatness. Innovation propelled by our workers, like the 4% of South Carolinians in the auto industry, is what drives a successful economy. Additionally, our ag community, our soybean producers concurred that the benefits of this agreement outweigh the downside. Dairy farmers like Glenn Easter now have the gold standard to sell in Canada in a fair and competitive market. As this agreement moves forward towards implementation, I plan to keep a very focused eye on how the rules and regulations surrounding this new automotive regime are carried out. Our regulatory environment should never be one that stifles innovation. Thank you.
Senator Cassidy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me compliment the President and Ambassador Lighthizer and their staff for the USTR for the significant time they have spent fine-tuning this agreement. Y'all have worked hard. I applaud that, and I thank you for that effort. Ambassador Lighthizer has made himself available, and I also want to compliment him on that. That said, I take issue strongly with the process that is taken before us. As a body, we continue to drift away from regular order. We've not held a markup or allowed amendments, therefore giving members of this committee little input. There's one specific example I will give to that. The investor-state dispute settlement system is, when it comes to the energy sector, no longer allowed except for the super majors that contract directly with the Mexican government. But if you are the oil field service provider or the pipeline producer, you're not. Now, I can tell you, ExxonMobil can take care of themselves. But if you're the oil field service provider, maybe you can't. And to Senator Whitehouse's point, my gosh, wouldn't it be great if we were taking that natural gas currently being flared into the atmosphere out of West Texas into Mexico, where the Mexican government could then replace coal or fuel oil being burned with lower greenhouse gas emitting natural gas. Not only would we not flare in the Desa Permian, but we would be substituting that for a higher greenhouse gas producing fuel in Mexico. But we don't have the investor-state dispute settlement system for the person that builds that pipeline. Now, they're going to do so anyway, I gather, but if it's later nationalized, there's no recourse for them. I can't help but notice that the House got a lot of stuff, because the House actually had the ability to say, we're not going to do this unless we get our demands met. We've not had that ability. So we've not had that ability to say, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. The super majors can take care of themselves, but the oil field service provider or the pipeline builder less so. And that could have benefits not just for our economy, not just for the certainty for the Mexican economy for investment, but also for issues such as climate change. I am very disturbed by that, and I think we continue to cede power from this committee to others to the detriment of our society. I yield back.
Okay. Now, for the people that are at the table for the next part of our review, we have Meyer Patel of the Republican staff and Greta Peisch of the Democratic staff. We also have John Mali and Maria Pagang from the Office of U.S. Trade Representative here to answer questions. Thank you all for participating. And we're going to ask Mr. Patel to give a brief overview of the bill before we go to questions. And when we go to questions, I will call on you the way you asked recognition. Mr. Patel.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the committee. I will start with a general overview and then proceed to discuss the specific titles of the bill. The USMCA implementing bill ensures that the various commitments and rights of the United States under USMCA are effectively implemented, and that there is a smooth transition from NAFTA to USMCA. To that end, the implementing bill contains provisions to implement USMCA commitments, provisions to transfer and amend former NAFTA Implementation Act provisions into the USMCA Implementation Act, and a provision to repeal what remains of the NAFTA Implementation Act. Several provisions specify particular effective dates to facilitate the transition. With respect to the specific titles in the bill, there are 9, which I will briefly summarize. Title I, Approval of and General Provisions relating to the USMCA. This title includes provisions providing for Congress's approval of USMCA and related protocols, and the Statement of Administrative Action, and the President's Tariff Proclamation Authority and agency's regulatory authority to implement USMCA. Title II, Customs Provisions. This title includes provisions providing for rules to determine whether a good qualifies for USMCA's benefits, including special rules that apply to automotive goods, the establishment of an interagency committee to review USMCA's implementation and operation with respect to automotive goods, record-keeping requirements on persons completing USMCA certifications, and authority for the Secretary of Treasury to conduct verification actions on USMCA preferential duty claims. Title III, Application of USMCA to Sectors and Services. This title includes provisions establishing a process with the U.S. International Trade Commission to investigate whether Mexican trucking carriers are causing material harm to the U.S. long-haul trucking industry. Title IV, Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Duties. This title includes provisions providing for the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection to take into consideration that Canada and Mexico are USMCA parties for purposes of trade enforcement and compliance assessment, activities relating to evasion of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. It also concludes conforming amendments to reflect that the binational panel system under Chapter 19 of NAFTA will continue under Chapter 10 of USMCA. Title V, Transfer Provisions and Other Amendments. This title includes provisions that transfer and amend provisions from the NAFTA Implementation Act into the USMCA Implementation Act, such as provisions dealing with duty drawback and relief from import competition under the Trade Act of 1974. Title VI, Transition to and Extension of USMCA. This title has 3 subtitles. Subtitle A repeals the NAFTA Implementation Act and provides for the continued suspension of the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Subtitle B imposes requirements on the President to consult with the appropriate congressional committees regarding actions through the USMCA Joint Review Mechanism, including whether to extend the term of USMCA. Subtitle C provides that the USMCA Implementation Act will cease to have force to any country that is no longer a USMCA country, or if the USMCA ceases to be enforced with respect to the United States. Title VII, Labor Monitoring and Enforcement. This title has 5 subtitles relating to labor rights and obligations under USMCA. Subtitle A establishes an interagency labor committee for monitoring and enforcement. It will coordinate implementation and compliance with labor obligations, make recommendations to USTR for enforcement actions, and facilitate submissions to the public regarding a USMCA country's potential failure to implement its labor obligations under the agreement. Subtitle B provides that the Secretary of Labor will hire or assign 5 labor attachés to assist the Interagency Labor Committee. The attachés will be based at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. Subtitle C establishes an independent Mexico Labor Expert Board that will issue assessments of Mexico's efforts to implement its labor reforms and compliance with its labor obligations under USMCA. Subtitle D establishes a forced labor enforcement task force to monitor U.S. enforcement on the prohibition of importation of goods manufactured by convict or forced labor. Subtitle E concerns the rapid response mechanism set forth in Annex 31A of the USMCA. In particular, the provisions provide USTR authority to suspend liquidation of entries of goods from covered facilities and apply final remedies only if a panel of independent labor experts finds a denial of rights. Title 8, Environment Monitoring and Enforcement. This title has 3 subtitles relating to environmental obligations under USMCA. Subtitle A establishes an interagency environment committee for monitoring and enforcement. The committee shall carry out an assessment of whether USMCA countries' environmental laws are sufficient to meet USMCA's obligations. Subtitle B provides that the EPA administrator shall carry out treatment works to address pollution resulting from the international transboundary water flows from Mexico. Subtitle C provides for capital reauthorization for the North American Development Bank. And Title IX, USMCA Supplemental Appropriations Act 2019. This title appropriates $843 million to implement, monitor, and enforce USMCA's labor and environment obligations and to recapitalize the North American Development Bank. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation of the bill. Thank you.
Senator Toomey.
Chairman, so I have a question, and I'd like to follow that up with an amendment that I understand you're going to rule out of order. So let me direct my question to Mr. Melly. Could you just tell me, what was the date on which the complete final legal text of the agreement was transmitted to Congress?
May 30th of last year, along with a draft SAA.
Okay, so my colleagues, I just listened to, I think, every single Democrat on this panel talk about how significant, meaningful, important the changes in the agreement were that occurred after May 30th. I heard many of my Democratic colleagues say that they opposed the May 30th agreement, but I think I heard most of my Democratic colleagues say that they now support the agreement because of all the major changes that have occurred. And we all know that's what happened here. We had an agreement on May 30th that was not acceptable to most Democrats, not acceptable to the Speaker of the House. And so negotiations continued with Bob Lighthizer and Speaker Pelosi and other figures, I don't know who they were, and major changes were negotiated. That's all fine. That's all fine. But the problem is those changes weren't finalized until December 10th. Transmit that, though all of those changes that you folks have said are the reason you're supporting this, came to us on December 11th. And TPA is very clear. It says that any agreement shall enter into force if and only if the President, at least 30 days before submitting to Congress the materials under subparagraph E, which is the implementing bill, submits to Congress a copy of the final legal text of the agreement. We all know that that final legal text wasn't here until December 11th. The House voted anyway a week later. And here we are today, totally jammed by the House and this process, not even able to offer an amendment. Senator Cassidy suggested an idea for an amendment that certainly ought to have merited some consideration by this committee. And I have a suggestion. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to offer this amendment, Mr. Chairman, because as I indicated earlier, USMCA expires in 16 years unless all 3 parties simultaneously and mutually agree to extend it for 6 years. Okay. Well, the implementing bill is silent on any process by which the U.S. would come to the decision as to whether or not to extend it for another 6 years. All it does is it states that the head of state, that's the president, will transmit the decision, but it doesn't say how we get to that decision. So who's going to decide? Does the president decide? Does Congress have any say in that at all, or are we just passive witnesses, bystanders, while others decide about our constitutional responsibility? Do you think there's a chance that could be disputed? I do. So I have an amendment. It's a Toomey Amendment number 1. And it says the amendment would insert at 621, section 621, language requiring both houses of Congress to affirmatively vote to have USMCA expire pursuant to the underlying agreement's sunset clause. In the absence of said congressional votes, the default U.S. position shall be that USMCA ought to be extended for another 6 years. So all this does is it says that Congress gets to decide, at least play a role in making the decision about whether or not this agreement is extended or expired. It does not require renegotiating the agreement, doesn't require reopening. Nobody has to fly to Mexico to determine whether it's okay with the Mexicans. This is our decision, the United States of America, and the question is whether or not Congress would have a role. This is the kind of thing that in a proper markup, I think we would have an interesting discussion. There's nothing partisan about this idea, by the way, nothing at all. I could imagine this could come out many ways. It's exactly the kind of thing that ought to be debated and adjudicated in this committee, in my view. And I would like to have a vote on this, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, well, first of all, the bill is privileged under the Trade Promotion Authority, and thus amendments are prohibited. The amendment's out of order, and Toomey is in his right to appeal the ruling of the chair, and I would ask that we would vote no on that motion, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
as I thought my staff had indicated, I'm prepared not to appeal the ruling of the chair on this. I think I know what the outcome is going to be on this, but I want to make a point. The fact that the 30-day window was not adhered to means this legislation is not compliant with TPA. We should not be considering it under TPA, and that's not going to stop it from passing. There are 60 votes to do this through regular order, but this amendment is, I think, a completely reasonable, germane, relevant issue that ought to be litigated by the committee.
I would like to, just for a minute, speak to the point that Mr. Toomey made in regard to the substance of his amendment. I want to note that the administration, at my request, revised the bill to include Section 611 to ensure that Congress and the administration work together in any decision regarding extending USMCA's terms. This is another example of how the administration consulted with Congress in developing the bill. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have one or two questions. Ms. Peiss, yesterday, ProPublica published a story that showed how big, well-connected businesses have been able to hire expensive trade lobbyists to advocate for their tariff exclusions, while small businesses are struggling to navigate the process and are being hit hard by the impact of tariffs. The article notes how Apple, for example, took its case directly to the president and got a significant number of exclusions approved. Meanwhile, small businesses like my constituents in New Jersey have had to wait months for an answer and have no way of knowing how USTR will judge their applications. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the article be entered into the record.
Without objection, it will be entered.
No one can say that this is a fair, transparent way to conduct trade policy. And we already have evidence from the Department of Commerce Inspector General that the Commerce Section 232 exclusion process lacks transparency and, quote, contributes to the appearance of improper influence in decision-making. Would it be fair to say that establishing, as we're talking about, the implementation of this ultimate trade agreement, that establishing an Inspector General for USTR would help correct the lack of transparency and appearance of favoritism that so many small businesses in New Jersey and across the country feel is taking place with USTR's tariff exclusion process?
Yes, Senator, it would.
Let me ask you one other question. This bill gives USTR a number of new authorities to implement USMCA. But as I discussed in my opening statement, we can't be sure that USTR will implement it as written without strong oversight that ensures transparency and accountability. Ms. Peiss, Title VII of this bill sets out the mechanism for labor monitoring and enforcement. Could an Inspector General review USTR's compliance with these requirements to ensure labor cases are being appropriately examined and acted upon?
Yes.
Section 202 of the bill sets out procedures USTR must follow to consider requests by automotive companies for additional time to comply with USMCA's new and complex rules of origin. Could an Inspector General review USTR's procedure to ensure this is done fairly and transparently?
Yes.
And finally, Title IX appropriates $90 million to USTR to monitor and enforce labor and environmental obligations. Could an Inspector General audit USTR's use of these funds to ensure that they're used as Congress instructed?
Yes, it could.
So, Mr. Chairman, voting on USMCA doesn't mean our work is finished. A strong... Oh, okay. I am. I'm just simply suggesting that voting on USMCA doesn't mean that our work is finished. A strong oversight will be critical to ensure this agreement succeeds, and an Inspector General for USTR would be a valuable tool this committee could use to make sure our trade policy actually benefits American working families. I know the chairman has been a strong advocate of Inspector Generals and their work in other areas, and I look forward to working with you and the ranking member to follow up on this issue.
We will do that, Senator Menendez.
And Mr. Chairman, if I...
Senator Wyden.
If I might, I'm going to be very, very brief. Not only do I agree with Senator Menendez, but on this committee, Senator Cornyn and Senator Casey, I think, have really been vigorous in terms of enforcement, trade enforcement. So they're going to have some heavy lifting to do in the days ahead. And Senator Menendez is very much on point.
Chairman. Orsia, okay, okay. Okay. Either way, okay. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Rob. I'd like to ask a few questions about Brown-Wyden to you, Ms. Pace, if I could, about the provisions in the included agreement to make sure the committee, that all of us understand how the proposal is intended to work and why it's significant. Senator Wyden and I pushed for Brown-Wyden to strengthen labor enforcement to make the enforcement process more accessible to workers. The question is, Ms. Pace, is it true that under Brown-Wyden, a worker himself can file a complaint through a hotline to kickstart the enforcement process?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, thank you. In all of our other FTAs, the only labor enforcement available was at the government level. A government can bring a case against another government for systemic labor violations, but that's been it in the past. Brown-Wyden changes that by allowing us to target specific private sector facilities. Can you tell us, Ms. Pace, how long the enforcement process in Brown-Wyden will take once that worker files a complaint through the hotline, and how does that compare to the length of time enforcement under other free trade agreements?
Enforcement under the Brown-Wyden procedures would take a matter of months, approximately around 150 days. This is significantly shorter than state-to-state dispute settlement, which in the case of the United States case against Guatemala took over 8 years.
Okay, thank you. One of the most groundbreaking parts of Brown-Wyden is it will allow us to take enforcement actions when the violations occur on the factory floor. So if a worker reports violation of his rights to organize it, it's say a call center, we think the complaint has merit. The U.S. can send a panel of labor inspectors to that facility, correct?
Correct.
And if those labor inspectors find violations on the site when they inspect the facility, we can take action against that specific facility, correct?
Correct.
What kinds of actions can we take against that facility, if you would explain that?
The United States could impose tariffs or apply penalties for first-time offenders, including with respect to imports for which the United States has suspended liquidation during the course of that investigation.
So in proportional terms, proportional to the offense, but then in the second and third beyond that, correct?
That's correct.
So if we find there are labor violations at a car factory, we can apply that penalty to any cars that might come into the U.S. from that factory throughout the investigation, not just going forward, correct?
Correct.
And what happens to repeat offenders? Does a violation have to happen at the same factory for it to be considered a repeat offense? Or is it considered a repeat offense if a violation occurs at a second or third factory owned by the same company?
It's the latter. If it's a factory owned by the same company, it is not a facility-specific repeat offense. It's by the owner.
And if there are 3 violations, what happens by the third?
For 3 violations, the United States would have the ability to block goods, again, from the company, not the specific facility for that 3rd violation.
Is this after walking through this, is this the strongest labor enforcement ever included in a trade agreement, to your knowledge?
Yes, it is.
Do you think Brown-Wyden will cause corporations to think twice about offshoring productions from Ohio or Michigan or Kansas or Idaho or Iowa or Oregon to Mexico so they can maximize their profits?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask about digital trade. And Mr. Melly, since I talked about you earlier, I'd love to have your response to this, but also any others. One, can you talk to us a little bit about how the digital trade provisions in here are different? And specifically, would you say that they go beyond the digital trade commitments in TPP as an example, and therefore would be the highest quality digital trade chapters in any U.S. trade agreement?
Certainly. Again, the NAFTA is an old agreement, and so we have updated it. Digital is certainly one area where trade has expanded considerably and where we need additional disciplines to reflect that change. And so we've captured those in the USMCA agreement. Let me turn to my cheat sheet here.
John, while you're doing that, let me just make the point that this is not just an idle threat. And Canada for years has been talking about the possibility of putting in place a digital services tax as an example. We've seen what's happening in Europe. So for every member of this panel, all of whom have, as I do, a lot of constituents who are involved in internet services, internet trade, this is a big deal because it establishes not just for a huge market like Canada or Mexico, our #1 trading partners combined, but also for future trade agreements, a new precedent. And my question is this precedent unprecedented? In other words, is it the highest quality digital trade chapter we have?
Absolutely. As a general matter, we took what we had begun to negotiate in the TPP and our other agreements, and we plussed that up whenever that was possible, and that's certainly the case in the USMCA as compared to the prior agreements that we negotiated. So the disciplines are certainly go beyond what we negotiated in the TPP and any other trade agreement for that matter.
Okay. With regard to auto rules of origin, we talked about this earlier in the free rider issue. One of my concerns about the rules of origin is that other countries take advantage of the trade agreement we have, in this case primarily with Mexico, but also Canada, and they bring auto parts in from other countries, China being the country that is probably the most, use this the most frequently. And then the car, in essence, isn't a North American car. It's a North American car in terms of its benefits that it gets from the reduction and really the zeroing out of the tariffs. But in essence, other countries are free riding on our agreement with Canada and Mexico. And that's why I did support raising the percentage of the car that has to be made in North America. And I think that makes sense from a trade point of view if you want to expand trade, because then these other countries have to realize if they want to take advantage of these bigger openings in our market, they should do a trade agreement with us. And then we get reciprocal access to their markets as well, because they're not providing any of that reciprocity by just free riding on the North American free trade agreement. Can you talk a little about that, or someone else on the panel here, and explain what that's going to mean in terms of auto production in the United States? Will that increase the amount of auto production in the United States because we have higher and tighter rules of origin?
You're exactly right, Senator. The goal of the free trade agreement is to encourage trade among the partners that have negotiated that agreement and have made concessions to one another to put that agreement into place. In the case of the auto sector, we have a very vibrant, large, and well-integrated North American industry, so in my mind, there's no better candidate for rules of origin that continue to build on that integration and encourage additional investment, innovation, production, and supply chains in North America. So the original NAFTA had a regional value requirement of 62.5%, and there were some loopholes that allowed some components to be made offshore and count towards that or not be counted against that number. The new total will be 75%. The other point I would make is there is a transition period to get to that. We have additional requirements. You mentioned the steel. There's also an aluminum requirement. There's also a wage requirement. There are other requirements on making core parts for an automotive vehicle. All of those are intended to be phased in over a period of time. We have been working with all the producers and with the suppliers in the auto industry throughout this process to make sure we are getting the balance right in terms of encouraging investment in North America, and especially in the United States, not penalizing their competitiveness and keeping and expanding the auto industry in the United States. We expect billions and billions of additional investments to be made, largely in the United States, as a result of these provisions. We paid particular attention to new technologies, batteries, electric vehicles, for example, to make sure we set ground rules that encourage that investment and that of innovation in the United States and in North America.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I commend you and your colleagues for focusing on this issue of manufacturing and particularly automobiles and the opportunity to have, in a sense, a renaissance of manufacturing here in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before I call on Senator Carper, let me say how I think this meeting will end. We want all questions because Senator Toomey has asked for the courtesy of making the last statement or whatever he wants to do before we vote. So I'll call on Senator Carper, and then if anybody else has questions, let me know so we can honor Senator Toomey. Go ahead, Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to join my colleagues in welcoming Ben Sass to our committee. It's great to have you with us, Ben. You'll add a lot, I'm sure. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Chairman, I want to ask unanimous consent that my written statement be entered into the record. I spoke earlier today, but I did not ask unanimous consent that my written statement be entered into the record. I'd like to do that at this time. I want to reiterate, since Sheldon Whitehouse was not in the room when I spoke earlier, I commended him, Ben Cardin, and other members of the Environment and Public Works Committee, and all of our staffs for working so hard to make sure that there's not only adequate language in the USMCA with respect to environmental protections, but we actually provided the money to make those protections real. One quick question, if I could, of our panel. Can any of you recall anything that Satchel Paige ever said with respect to birthdays? Any words of wisdom from Satchel Paige with respect to birthdays? Can any of you recall that? Satchel Paige, on the 59th birthday of John Thune, which is today, I would just always remember the words of Satchel Paige, who once said, "How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? Work like you don't need the money. Dance like nobody's looking. Love like you've never been hurt. Live each day like it's your last, and someday you'll be right." And with that, the words of Satchel Paige to my friend,
Chairman, if I
John
could,
Thune. Happy birthday, John.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, Senator Thune is also celebrating his birthday with an important provision in this agreement, the de minimis provision that helps a lot of small businesses, and I congratulate him for his leadership.
Okay, Senator Langford.
I have just two quick questions on this. One
Oh,
is,
by the way, Senator Carper's statement will be entered in the record without objection.
I just want to ask for any additional clarification on the intellectual property. There's been much spoken about the protection of IP and what that means and the additional layers on that, and I have one follow-up question after that.
Well, there's a number of improvements we've made in this agreement. Again, the NAFTA is a very old agreement, and in IP terms, perhaps ancient applies to that. So some of the upgrades that we have included here, the minimum term of protection for copyright works for authorship is plus 70 years and is 75 years from publication. We've added new deterrent civil and criminal penalties for camcording, which has been a particular problem in this area in recent years. There's authority now for border enforcement officials to stop goods that are suspected of being pirated or counterfeited at points of entry. We don't have that authority without this agreement. We have the highest standards.
That's for all three nations, by the way.
Correct. Yes, all of these would be applied across the board by all three countries. We have the highest standards for procedural safeguards regarding geographical indications. Again, that's an important issue with respect to some other trading partners outside of North America. We've got the strongest standards in any U.S. trade agreement for the protection of trade secrets against misappropriation, civil and criminal causes of action, litigation protections, and so forth. I'm going on at great length, just a couple of more very quickly. There are both criminal and civil remedies for cable and satellite signal theft. There's full national treatment to prevent discrimination against U.S. protectors, and there's strong protection against circumvention of technological protection to protect digital content. So those are the highlights of this new chapter that go beyond the original agreement.
Thank you. One additional follow-up. There are 7 treaties that are mentioned in the protocol amendment. Are there any additional American obligations for those 7 existing treaties? Those treaties are mentioned. but are there additional American obligations that are added in this agreement?
Right, there are no additional U.S. obligations.
Thank you.
Oh, Senator Corner. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll be brief. I alluded to this in my opening statement, but I just want to perhaps provide a little additional clarification. Mr. Maley, the concern has to do with the respect to distilled spirits, in this case, Sotol. Apparently, this would also apply to other distilled spirits, but since this is a distilled spirit that comes from 22 different plant species that grow naturally on both sides of the U.S. and Mexico border, there is concern about the U.S. recognition of Sotol as a distinctive product of Mexico, and whether it would contravene the purposes of 27 U.S.C. Section 205E, under which the Secretary of the Treasury is charged with developing regulations on packaging, marketing, branding, and labeling, as will prohibit deception of consumers with respect to distilled spirits products. Are you familiar with that issue? I believe that was the subject of a letter by the USTR. Again, I appreciate the chairman working with us on the report language to make sure that the congressional intent is upheld and that deception is avoided. But would you care to shed some light or thoughts on that?
Certainly, Senator. Yes, there was a side letter that was signed with Mexico as part of the negotiation package, and we did agree to initiate a review of 3 distilled spirits that are made in Mexico. But we did nothing to change the U.S. process for conducting that review. We have no obligation to any particular outcome from any of those reviews, and certainly will follow U.S. law practice, and that includes certainly an opportunity for public comment and participation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For those members of the committee who've never consumed Sotol, I would recommend it to them.
Okay. Is it okay now to go to Senator Toomey? Senator Toomey?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and colleagues on the committee. I'll be very brief. I would just like to engage in a brief colloquy to determine if the chairman and the ranking member agree that the absence of a markup should not be considered a precedent for how we in this committee will deal with future trade agreements under TPA.
Well, TPA prohibits amendments and does not require a mock markup. Mock markups are optional. They can be an important tool for Congress to share its views with the executive branch. To fulfill its purposes, a mock markup has to happen before the introduction of a bill. We're obviously well past that now. Congress has shared its views on USMC for over a year. Critically, this administration has acted in response by implementing bipartisan feedback into the bill. In this very unique situation, there was no time for a mock markup. These unique circumstances should not be considered precedent for future FTA considerations, but we have weighed in formally through hearings and informally through meetings with the administration for over the year. Now we should proceed to deliver on USMCA, which is indisputably valuable to the American people. Senator White.
Senator Toomey, I largely agree with the chairman on this, and I would only add that I think mock markups are a valuable part of the process, and I am committed to more mock markups in the future.
Now I would like to have the roll call. Would the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Crapo.
Grable.
Aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Burr.
Okay, I guess Burr doesn't have a proxy. Oh, aye by proxy.
Mr. Burr, aye by proxy. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Toomey. No. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Yeah. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Langford. Aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. Young. Aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Wyden.
Aye.
Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Stabenow. Aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cardin.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cardin, aye by proxy. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Ms. Hessen. Ms. Hessen, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye.
Would you announce the vote?
Mr. Chairman, the final tally is 25 ayes, 3 nays.
25 ayes, 3 nays. The bill is reported. I'd like to say thank you to some people. First of all, this is a big bipartisan vote, a reminder that when Congress works together in a bipartisan way, the American people greatly benefit. I want to thank my colleagues again for working with the Trump administration and me and Senator Wyden. I also want to thank members of my Finance Committee trade staff for their very, very hard work. Ranking Member Wyden and his staff have worked with me through this whole process, and I'm grateful for that cooperation as well. I look forward to a vote on the Senate floor, hopefully soon for final passage. Meeting adjourned.
Here we are.
Give me the mic. Hold on.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I hear you.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
I think it might be bright enough.
Hey, look, there's my
I
light.
don't think you need the light. Where the hell is it? So still working with the back in here? Yeah, you're good. All right. I got a wire. Christine, let me slap this up here. You want to get, you're going to need to get in the front. Which sounds best. Is that all right?